My parents just got home from the movies not too long ago. I've been pretty sick for the past couple of days, so I couldn't go. When they got in, I asked them what movie they ended up seeing. Dad said it was called The Red Door. Funny, I hadn't heard of it before. I asked them if the movie was any good. Mom said it was the saddest movie she'd ever seen. Her eyes were very red and puffy. She tried to recall parts of the movie, but she couldn't make it past 2 words before she'd start crying again. It was weird because her cheeks were dry when she cried, like she had used up every tear for the movie. But when I asked Dad what he thought of it, he said it was the funniest movie of the decade, maybe of all time. His eyes weren't red and puffy like Mom's were, but his smile seemed like a permanent part of his face. Like he couldn't force a frown even if his life depended on it. He kept trying to recall parts of the movie too, but every time he did, he'd burst into a fit of laughter. It wasn't a fun laugh either. It sounded like it hurt him to laugh. I thought it was strange that my parents had such differing opinions on the movie, and I didn't like the contrast between Mom's sadness and Dad's joy. It reminded me too much of those masks you'd see at a fancy Broadway play. Those comedy and tragedy masks that were conjoined at the face. Was the movie a drama? A comedy? Both, maybe? I was too sick to come to any sort of conclusion. Flu season is a bitch. When I turned on the television, I saw that people were protesting the film outside of a movie theater somewhere in a different city. There were a bunch of confused and angry faces on the TV. Most were holding signs that expressed their outrage of the film's content. The signs were a jumble of odd accusations.
"The Red Door equals satanic smut,"
read one sign.
"The Red Door is the door to oblivion,"
read another. There was a reporter from the news channel interviewing one of the women from the protest. Her eyes burned bright with righteous indignation.
"The man who made this film is a devil,"
she spat.
"I will not have this godless crap shown in my city. It's poison."
The reporter, sensing that she wasn't going to get much else from this woman, began to pull away, but the woman was quicker. She grabbed the reporter's arm in a manner that wasn't aggressive, but clear in its message. She wasn't done speaking.
"My son's friends went and saw this movie,"
she went on.
"Caught themselves an early screening, and do you know where they are now? At Hope Hills Hospital. They are in a mental institution. That's right. Thank the Lord above I caught my boy sneaking out before he got to that screening with his so-called friends. This is a warning to all good, God-loving and God-fearing Christians. This movie is from hell."
By this point, the reporter had regained control of the microphone. The woman put her hands up in a gesture that said, "I've said my piece," and wandered back into the thicket of her fellow protesters. I wondered why people were so upset over the film. Sure, there had been protesters at cinemas before, but this felt different. There were a lot of protesters at the cinema, and I wondered if this was an isolated situation or if people were protesting the film elsewhere. I went and asked Mom and Dad if they saw any protesters outside of the theater they went to, but they were too busy getting their shoes and coats back on. I asked my dad what he and Mom were doing. He said they were going to see the movie again. I was surprised by this. Mom and Dad have never gone back to a theater to see the same movie twice, let alone on the same night. They left. Dad was still giggling as he shut the door. Mom kept sobbing as she made her way to the car. They were acting very strange tonight. I went back to watching the news. Now there was someone else being interviewed. It was an attendee of the film. The reporter asked the man what he had thought of the movie. The man looked scared, downright terrified in fact. He couldn't seem to keep his voice steady, but a few shaky words could be heard through his chattering teeth, such as,
"Nearly scared me to death.
and
Won't be sleeping tonight, or any night to come."
it sounded like he meant it. The phone rang, which gave me a bit of a jump. I hadn't realized how on edge I was. It was my friend, Jamie. I thought he was calling to see if I was feeling any better, or maybe to let me know what I had missed at school, but he wasn't calling me for any of those reasons. He was calling to talk to me about the movie, to talk about the Red Door. I told him that I hadn't seen it yet. He sounded oddly upset by this.
"What do you mean you haven't seen it?"
He said, with clear irritation in his voice. I tried telling him I was sick, but he ignored this.
"What do you mean you haven't seen it?"
He repeated this question several times, growing more and more upset. Soon he was shouting the question more than asking it. Again, I tried to tell him that I was sick, but he wasn't listening. He just kept screaming at me over the phone. At that point, I had to hang up on him. I've never heard Jamie so upset before. Whatever this movie was about, I was starting to think that I didn't want to know. It was making everyone act weird. I went back to watching the news, hoping Jamie was cooling down at his house just a few blocks up the street. The newscasters were showing pictures of the film's director. There were shots of him on what looked like a movie set from the 60s. Then they cut to some grainy-looking footage of the director in a white robe. He was standing with his arms to the sky and his head tilted up. There must have been at least 400 or 500 people in the crowd that gathered around him. They all wore white robes too. Words appeared beneath the footage.
Former cult leader turned film director still silent on whereabouts of missing cult members.
The news anchor talked over this footage, mentioning the director's former life as a professor of quantum physics at a university that had fired him for misconduct, accusing him of indoctrinating students into his ever-growing cult. When the university discovered his intentions to relocate his new followers to a remote part of the jungle, the authorities were contacted, and the would-be director was put in jail for a time. He was soon bailed out by his loyal-to-the-bone followers, and before authorities knew, the former professor turned full-time cult leader had fled with his flock to a forbidden piece of that jungle. The man in the footage looked like a half-crazed warlock. His hair was done up in a ponytail so tight that it was hard to tell how old he was. Maybe as young as 25 or as old as 50. The man had an unnatural air to him that made me uncomfortable. He looked almost inhuman. His eyes would not look out of place if they were stuffed into the sockets of a dangerous predator, like that of a tiger or a bird of prey. Those eyes, it felt wrong to stare at them for so long. It was as if, even from a photograph, the man had the ability to bore into your brain with that alien gaze, find the meat of you, and bite into it. My parents actually went to see this guy's movie? I didn't like the thought, so much so that I felt an unexpected wave of nausea wash over me. I grabbed the trusty puke bucket, but only dry heaved into it. Looking up from the bucket, I saw that the news had cut away from the footage. Was I crazy? Or did it look like the news anchor was going to be sick as well? He didn't look healthy. More corpse than News Corp. Maybe he ran late and didn't have the time to have his makeup done properly before the broadcast. But no, he really did look like he was about to throw up. He kept dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, yet it seemed futile, and those were definitely sweat stains under his armpits. I was about to shut off the television. The sickness was wearing me down with surprising force, when I heard a loud banging on my door. Then I heard a voice. It was Jamie. He was shouting from my front porch. I was shocked and ashamed to find that I was afraid to open the door. Even though Jamie was my friend, he was acting crazy. This wasn't like him at all. Jamie stopped shouting. It was silent for a moment. Then I heard him again. It sounded like he was crying. I couldn't understand his words at first. I thought maybe he'd come to take his anger out on me in person, but then I heard his sobs and his apologies for his behavior. He still sounded hysterical. But a sad friend is easier to manage than an angry one. I opened the door, expecting to see Jamie with tears running down his cheeks and a sorrowful look on his face, but that's not what I saw. Instead, I saw Jamie with a big grin on his face and a terrible twinkle in his eye. It was too jarring to comprehend. He had been sobbing and sniffling and apologizing between big whoops and gasps for air on the other side of the door, but when I opened it, Jamie looked overjoyed, overeager, and far too happy to see me. There was a look on his face that chilled me to the bone. It was a look of sick triumph. He was here because he wanted to take me to see the movie, even if he had to drag me there to see it. I would have laughed if I weren't so terrified at the prospect, so exhausted from the rapid decline of my health. Seriously, what was happening to me? I tried to tell Jamie again that I was sick and that I couldn't go. He wasn't having it. He just kept telling me the movie would cure what ails me. By the 14th or 15th no, I had to close the door on his face. A little harder than I'd meant to, but I was as frustrated as I was scared. The movie. The red door, there's something wrong with it. Something wrong with its director, something wrong about the whole damn thing. Jamie kept banging on the door. He sounded like he was getting angry again, and I didn't like the idea of being hogtied and dragged to the movies to see a film that I was starting to believe would do real, actual harm to me. I said that if he didn't stop, I would call the cops. He laughed at this, actually cackled like a hyena. The cops. But they love the movie too. Go ahead and call them. We can all go down to the theater together. I bet the cops will even turn their flashers on so we can get there as fast as possible. We'll have the best seats in the house. I tried to ignore him and focus on the television, turning the volume all the way up. Maybe he'd run out of steam eventually. The scene I saw now had changed dramatically. The footage was back to the reporter on the scene. I wondered what happened to the sickly-looking news anchor. Other people were streaming out of the theater now. Some were walking toward the protesters. Others began to pick up objects on the ground. Everyone who'd come out of the theater wore differing expressions of intense anger, overwhelming joy, cold terror, or deep sadness, all of which were maddeningly heightened by their wide, insane eyes, bared teeth, and overexposed gums. The protesters stood no chance. Bottles, rocks, and other random objects of heft hit them from top to bottom. Some of the protesters tried to fight back, but those who did were swarmed by several attendees like honeybees on a wasp. A few protesters were being dragged into the theater. Those that dragged them in wore hideously mismatched expressions on their faces. It became so violent in a moment's notice that the reporter was knocked to the ground after a brick came hurtling into view, making contact with the back of her head and producing the sound you might think a coconut would make once you broke open its tough shell. The camera went shaky as the remaining news crew fled, followed by the sound of more objects, likely whatever was in reach, hitting the pavement behind them. A bottle broke in front of the cameraman and made him cry out. One of the crewmen was grabbed by a group of attendees, the camera catching a brief glimpse of his feet. Both legs kicked wildly as they were dragged into and then out of the camera's view. Then the screen went black. Everything went black. The power had gone out. I was alone in my house, in the pitch dark, and Jamie wouldn't stop banging on the front door. Somewhere, a riot was happening, and if this film was being shown elsewhere, if this movie was making people act like crazed animals, then there was something seriously wrong with the world tonight. This was madness, or the worst kind of nightmare one could have. The kind that sneaks up on you. The kind that no matter how much you struggle against it, telling yourself it's not real, tightens its grip even further. The television came back on. There was no power, yet somehow it came back on. I heard the thump of Jamie's shoe against my door, followed by another. There was a sound of splintering wood. Somewhere between the moment when the door came crashing down after the third kick and the moment when Jamie grabbed me with unnatural strength, laughing like a lunatic as he did so, I think that was when I realized that there was no waking from this nightmare. "Didn't you hear?" Jamie shouted, his face a twisting conflict of emotion. "They're going to show the movie on television. Every channel. Look, it's happening right now." His voice was near childlike as he said this, looking over the TV with eyes so wide I feared they might fall out of his skull. I didn't want to look, but something twisted my head toward the screen. Couldn't have been Jamie's hand. He had both of them gripping my arm so tight I was afraid he was going to snap a bone. The movie was starting, and I couldn't fight the invisible force that held my head steadfast, no matter how hard I struggled against it. Too sick, too weak to fight back. The nightmare was tightening its grip. Or was that just Jamie squeezing my arms? Did he finally break my bones? I thought I heard a crack. I don't know anymore. I don't think I can care anymore. I'm just so tired. I can't say why I gave in. I wanted to believe that I had a chance to get away. Wanted to believe I could survive this nightmare. Though, I think a part of me knew that there was no fighting this. Like stage 3 lung cancer, what was the point? The cancer had won. The film had spread before anyone knew what was really happening. Outside, I could hear people screaming in the streets. Or were they laughing? It was hard to tell. Maybe it was both. They were muffled by the sounds of windows smashing and car alarms blaring in the distance, growing louder, growing closer. All I knew was that it was either watch the movie or die horribly with my eyes shut tight. You can probably guess which fate I chose. And if you were as exhausted, as completely drained of all fight, even before the bell rang, even before knowing who or what you were up against, you'd have chosen the same fate as me. I think the worst part was when I finally looked at the screen. I recognized what it was that I was seeing. I shouldn't have been able to, but I did. I knew what I was looking at, and it was awful. But it was the kind of awful that made you laugh. The kind of feeling you'd get when you'd think every horrible thing in your life is because someone or something bigger than you just wants to watch you suffer. Only to have that feeling affirmed right before your eyes. You have no choice but to smile, a mirthless smile. There was no fight left in me after that, and I couldn't help but laugh. That made Jamie do something I didn't think was possible. It made his smile grow even bigger. But I do have to admit, Jamie was right about the movie. It did cure what ailed me. I haven't felt this good in a very long time. Perhaps better than I've ever felt before. I think the director is going to change the world with his film, for better or worse. And yes, I've seen the movie. Many times now, in fact. I have to agree with my dad on this one. It is by far the funniest movie I've ever seen in my life. We plan to watch it again. Over and over, again and again. The red door is open now, and there is no closing it, not after seeing what lay beyond. Mom still doesn't see the humor in the film, and even though she still cries whenever she watches it, her tears have yet to return to her cheeks. She's always up for watching the movie with us, though. Maybe she didn't see the humor in the film, but I sure did. And to be honest with you, my face hurts so much because the movie is just... The red door, it's... I'm sorry. I can't keep writing this. It's just... The red door. Oh God, help me. It's so goddamned funny.